Hello, my beautiful, darling listeners, and welcome to the DJP. You know, I'm very active in the recovery community, and the thing that sucks by far the most for me is when people just refuse to get out of their own way. Like, listen, I know that life is hard. Trust me, I've had my fucking fair share of suffering, and it wasn't until I learned that a lot of it was self-made and entirely needless that I was able to get out of my own way. You know that little voice in your head that tells you that you'll never be okay, that you're not enough, that you're hopelessly broken? Yeah, you know the one I'm talking about. That rotten son of a bitch that just never shuts the fuck up. That, my friends, is your inner critic. And the funny thing about that little voice is it's really only there to try to help you. Yep, it's fucked up. Trust me, I know. But that voice, it was installed by your brain at a really early age as a mechanism to protect your tiny little baby heart from being broken into a million pieces. And you can call it anything you want. You can call it your inner critic, your judge, Judge Judy, whatever you want. Judge Reinhold. That's a throwback, right? Hey, but if we're looking at it from a Dharma lens, we in the Buddhist community tend to call it Mara. Mara was the demon that could, try to tempt the Buddha away from awakening when he was sitting under the Bodhi tree. Well, anyway, Mara shows up as what is referred to as the 5 hindrances. And these are basically the 5 hindrances to awakening. And these are craving, aversion, lethargy, restlessness, and doubt. And the funny thing about these things and these hindrances and Mara is that more than likely, actually probably 100%, you absolutely needed these things when you were younger. But you're not 6 anymore, are you? I mean, I hope not, because you probably shouldn't be listening to this podcast because I tend to have a potty mouth. Anyway, thanks for always being there for me, Mara. But I just don't need you anymore, and you're getting in the way. And the bottom line is when that voice starts showing up, you just acknowledge it. You say, I see you, Mara, and I know you. And then you make friends with it and let it know that you appreciate it. But its services are absolutely no longer needed. And they're just views. They aren't reality. They are literally opinions, and they're probably shitty ones at that. I know it can be harsh. It's like the harshest shit in the world. And it's always just a little bit worse than the most critical person in your life, whoever that happened to be. And that's where the protection comes in. Because if you can endure the worst shit you can tell yourself, then maybe when that external critic fires up with their bullshit, maybe it won't hurt so bad. But it normally still does. So make friends with Mara and invite him in for tea. Anyway, I'm sorry for rambling, but okay, my guest today is David L. Carter. David holds degrees in theology, English lit, and library science. He lives in North Carolina and is published in Cities and Roads and the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling. We delve into some pretty interesting subjects on this episode, from the existence of God to my borderline conspiracy theorist musings on gain-of-function research, what gives life meaning, Disney rats, and more. So I hope you enjoy this episode. It was a pretty fun one to make. I really enjoy deep conversations like this, and I hope that the hate mail that I receive is minimal. Ladies and gentlemen, or whatever your choice of pronoun is, David L. Carter.
You might catch yourself sliding in and out of a hallucinatory state. Just relax and enjoy it. Just relax and enjoy it.
This is an experiment in mind formation. Information. Forming, controlling, operating your mind and your brain. Using digital techniques to overload, scramble, confuse, unfocus your mind. The natural state of the brain is chaos. Chaos is beautiful.
David Carter, how are you, man?
Good. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and taking the time to have a conversation with me. So, let's just go ahead and kick it off. You want to tell my audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, so obviously, name's David Carter, and I've done a lot of different things in terms of jobs, career that have kind of led me to the place where finally have kind of a stable job. I'm a librarian in the community college system here in North Carolina, and have finally found the time and stability to be able to work on writing and get some stuff published and out there. And so that's a lot of what I'm doing these days, is just concentrating on that and just trying to get the word out about my work. In my 20s, I grew up in North Carolina, kind of in the Bible Belt South, and, had experiences that that a lot of people have, in that kind of environment. I felt like most churches and religious leaders were pretty scandalous or close-minded. But as I got out of high school and started to think about, I took some years off, but I started to think about going to college and thinking about what I wanted to study. And it just had a growing interest in religious studies, and went to a school with a really good progressive religious studies department. And those were the classes that I did the best work in, I thought. So I went on from there. I really wanted to get out of North Carolina, get out of the South, see the world a little bit. So I had met through a friend of mine in the religious studies department. He worked for the Episcopal Student Center. He was kind of like the receptionist and secretary for the priest that ran the place. And the priest was a very interesting guy, very progressive in his ideals, very non-pushy about religion. And I got to be friends with him. And he told me about a very progressive seminary in Cambridge, Massachusetts that he had gone to. So I explored that and got interested in that and applied there and went up there. I didn't really have any desire. I hadn't grown up really having to go to church. My father was very great guy, very conservative though, very Republican, but he was an atheist. So that was kind of interesting.
That is a strange combination.
It really is. My mother grew up very religious, so I don't know where they were in terms of their relationship about those issues. So I guess the upshot is, because of my father's opinions, I wasn't pressured into joining any kind of church or any kind of community. And so it all just fascinated me. Right. So I went off to the seminary, didn't feel any desire to be ordained like most of the students there. So that was kind of interesting. And from earning that degree and getting some of the experiences that you get when you're undergoing theological education, they encourage you to do field work, either in a church or in some kind of social service that's run by the church. So I worked in a church-sponsored soup kitchen, worked as a hospital chaplain afterward. And so from that kind of fell into, for a few years, doing a lot of social work, outreach work. I didn't have a degree in social work, but I had enough education to be a caseworker, and I ran a little media center in the homeless shelter and did outreach for the homeless folks out in the woods who were shelter resistant. So all that was really interesting, but very could be hard work. And
I can imagine. Yeah, for sure.
A little bit unsustainable after a while. So eventually I went back to school, started teaching, and eventually from that, I'd always put myself through school working part-time in libraries, among other things. So I ended up working. Now I'm a librarian.
That's an interesting place to end up.
Yeah.
So what was it about theology that just grabbed you? Especially somebody that didn't grow up in the church. You said your father was an atheist, so you didn't have the classic Bible Belt getting drugged to church every Sunday like most of us. Because I'm from the Bible Belt as well. So I'm very familiar with with that life. So what exactly was it about theology? Was it just, do you think it was the fact that you weren't exposed to it in your youth that maybe made it interesting?
It's a good question, because I feel like, if you grew up here, you were exposed to it. It was all around. It was in the culture. It was.
Oh, yeah.
For example, I grew up, my whole family is from around here. I live in the Triangle area, which has grown up a lot. But the surroundings when I was growing up, it was all countryside, and my whole family was from around here. So I was always around relatives 3 and 4 generations back, very rural people, very, very religious. And so it was kind of, it was all around me, but I wasn't so involved that it felt invasive.
Right.
So I think that was helpful. I think I thought of it as maybe a little bit too conservative, but I had this family around me, and a lot of them were really nice and easygoing people. So I just didn't have a lot of the abusive experiences that some people have had,
right,
with that kind of environment. I think also, I was a big reader. And so my exposure to a lot of theology, even as a kid, came through, writers, storytellers that had kind of a religious commitment or a religious background. Writers like Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote Wrinkle in Time, which is probably her most famous book. And then C.S. Lewis, who I think the Narnia Chronicles, and I think the conservatives have kind of glommed onto him and kind of claimed him. But if you really look at him closely, he's a much more interesting and, in a way, more progressive thinker.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I actually was just listening to a debate between C.S. Lewis and Bertrand Russell a couple of weeks ago.
That's interesting.
It was a debate on the existence of God.
So was that something that was recorded? Because I know that Lewis did do some radio shows.
I think it was on PBS.
Okay, interesting. It was
on PBS.
I like Russell too. I think his critique of religion made sense. I think of Lewis's defense of religion made sense. So there are different ways of looking at it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there's as many ways to look at it as there are perspectives. Yep. I think everybody has a different view on religion and a different view on the existence of God in general. So I do have another question. Mm-hmm. Coming from essentially an atheist upbringing, because you.
Well, I didn't know. Right. I didn't know what my father. He didn't share that with me.
Now, was he a devout atheist? Did he deny the existence of God, or did he, would he fall into more the agnostic group of I just don't know, like you seem to have at that time anyway?
Well, I think if you had pushed him on it, he would have said, and maybe I did at certain times. I mean, we didn't argue about it. We argued about politics. We argued about a lot of stuff. Right. But I just don't argue about religion with people.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of pointless.
In my, my opinions can change tomorrow. That doesn't mean I don't have convictions, but, belief is a little bit more tricky than people seem to think. I think my father, I think there are some atheists out there who feel like they have the answer. I'm not sure my father would have said, well, I just know this is the answer. Everyone who thinks differently is stupid. But he may be technically an agnostic, but I don't know. He certainly had a lot of contempt for a lot of people involved in religion.
Yeah.
And I think it's something my parents never discussed.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting that wouldn't come up. But, there's so many arguments if we get into a philosophical debate about the existence of God, there's very compelling arguments for the existence of God, and there's very compelling arguments, against the existence of God. So, because there are so many compelling arguments on both sides of the fence, it can leave a lot of questions for sure. Thomas Aquinas, he had some pretty good arguments for the existence of God. I think you can definitely find some flaws in the premises, though, as you can with most arguments that are against the existence of God. And this is something that I think about a lot. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it's one of those philosophical questions that I have pondered on a lot. And it seems that you have as well. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have ended up pursuing theology and to the extent that you have.
Yeah, I think maybe the difference between the way my parents thought gave me the space in my own mind to kind of hold both positions, or at least consider both positions, even though I didn't, like I was saying, I didn't know. I knew how my mother felt and still feels. She has a very deep faith, I think, and informed by the culture around here, of course. But I don't feel like, if she was very pushy about it, then my parents, the whole relationship probably wouldn't have worked for very long. So
yeah, I can't imagine it would have.
So there's that piece too. It just, even from her side, it wasn't forced on me. And then again, I was coming across intelligent, thoughtful, metaphysical speculation. The writers that I was reading, or some of them, I was also reading Vonnegut, who was a pretty, and doctrinaire atheist, as far as I know.
Right.
At least had some sharp critiques of religion. So there was that too.
Right. So here's a weird question. What makes you have your faith? Like, what gives you faith that there is a God? Just as David Carter, why does David Carter think that God exists? Like,
well,
I just find, like I said, I find the conversation fascinating. They're just the existence or not the existence. And I don't know either way, I just don't know. I definitely feel like there is some sort of source. I don't know whether I can say it's the Christian God that we have, especially in the South, have been subjected to, but I definitely feel like there's something.
Well, here's the way I think about it. And this is really beyond whether my own feelings or beliefs. I feel like if you have a strong belief in the supernatural, or which is a term you can contest, or something other, something beyond creator, however you want to speculate about it. Generally, if you have that belief, it's because you've had certain experiences, whether they're the experience of going to a church and having the doctrine taught to you and it makes sense to you, or you have some kind of experience of the numinous, maybe in nature or just in everyday life. You just have that feeling of something other. Or, there are people who feel that they've had direct experience, heard the voice of God, seen God, or some deity in some form. So there's no proof. There is your experience, which you have. How are you not going to take that seriously? I think you should take your experience seriously, but also have the humility to not necessarily to question it, but allow that it can be questioned. Because there's just, there are no certainties. And I think when we, at least not in this life, so as long as we don't have proof, then we have to have humility.
Right.
If that makes sense.
It does. It does. I mean, I guess that's where faith comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, so if we're talking about, especially if we're talking about the Christian version of God or creator or source or whatever you want to call it, there's certain characteristics that make God God. And that's, God is omnipotent. He's omniscient. He's omnibenevolent, immortal and immaterial, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there's like, and this is what hangs me up with the existence of God. If God can't exist, well, first of all, we know that if God exists, then probably evil doesn't exist, right? But we know that evil does exist. So, it follows that if evil exists, then God can exist if he is omnibenevolent.
Mm-hmm. So,
like I said, these are the things that I sit and I think about. This is how I spend my time.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about there, and you definitely know your Aquinas, because I can hear those proofs that you're working with there, or the qualities. I'm sorry, the attributes that are being laid out. So you're talking about theodicy here, which is kind of
we are talking about theodicies. Yes.
There are just so many ways of thinking about that. So many people have grappled with it. And all I can say is I can just tell you the one that when I'm in the right headspace that makes the most sense for me. There was a theologian who just recently died, I think maybe in 2015, not too long ago.
Mm.
Her name was Marilyn McCord Adams.
Okay.
And she was, I think, at Yale most of her career and then at Oxford. But she apparently she did a little spiritual autobiography that late in her career that explained a lot of her own experience. And apparently she had suffered as a child really extreme and prolonged abuse. Although she was growing up in a very kind of evangelical household. And all of that experience somehow led her to first study philosophy and then study philosophy of religion. Eventually, she got ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. And one of her first pastoral positions was in LA and Los Angeles in the early 80s. And so she was working with a population of gay men who were the community was just being decimated by the AIDS outbreak. And just no one knew what was going on, incredible suffering. And so she, as a minister, was having to deal with this population that was experiencing so much suffering on top of so much hatred. And so she really had to grapple with the question of evil, and not only of evil, but what she called horrendous evils that just obliterate meaning in someone's life. And so that's pretty much what she dedicated her theological scholarship and her theological career to when she wrote a book called Christ and Horrors, which I've only skimmed the surface of, and one called Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, something like that. So that's her. She really lays it out, and pretty much given the problem of basically the suffering of the innocent and just the suffering of humanity, the suffering of creation, she comes around to a kind of a theodicy that really doesn't let God off the hook. So there, in her, if I'm understanding it right, in her analysis, there has to be some some way of conceiving of salvation that can even grapple with these kind of soul destroying evils, holocausts, genocides, things like that. She puts it all a lot better than I ever could. And, but it's really interesting trying to grapple with her analysis.
Right. Are you familiar with Taoism at all?
Not as much as I should be. I really, for whatever reason, in my education as an undergrad and even as a graduate, I just felt more comfortable. Not even comfortable is not the right word, but I felt like the more Western traditions, I was just better at studying them, at grappling with the concepts.
Right.
So yeah, I never got as deeply into, as much as interesting as they were to me, the Eastern religions. I'm just more ignorant about.
Right. Well, the reason I ask is, classically in Taoism, it's, you have yin and yang, and they can't exist without one another. You have the light and the dark. So, this is, like I said, something I think about a lot. And in regards to that, at least from a Taoist view, like evil has to exist. Otherwise, goodness can't exist, because goodness can't be measured against anything other than evil. Right. Mm-hmm. So if goodness can't be measured against anything other than evil, then both have to exist for one of them to exist. Like good can't exist without evil. So I think without evil, it gives no reason to seek virtue. And mm-hmm. without virtue, there's, no calling to spirituality.
And that rings true also. And that you can find that, I think, in any mature spiritual discipline. I guess the question for me comes down to why do certain things have to be so bad?
Right. Yeah. No, me too. I wonder that all the time. Trust me. I'm a Dharma practitioner. I don't really call myself a Buddhist, but I follow the Dharma, and the first noble truth in the Dharma is that life is contains suffering, and it's inescapable. Yeah.
Especially if you've had a kidney stone.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I've never had one, but I've had plenty of friends that have, and it does not seem pleasant. I had cancer when I was younger, so that was my experience with suffering.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine in the thick of those things how anything good can come of them.
Right. I think if I had to trace it back, I think, because like I said, I'm a cancer survivor, and I was diagnosed shortly after my 13th birthday. Yeah. So, I think having a childhood illness of that nature is what really led me down this path of asking these questions. Is there a God? If there is a God and he's a just God, why would he create so much suffering? So,
and you were involved in that time. You said you're going to, did you say Presbyterian?
Yeah. I was, at the time, I hadn't really been very much at that point, but I did grow up, in the Presbyterian church. Yeah.
So were they able to cope with that at all? Was that something you could take, to that community and have any sort of support with?
They were very supportive from a distance. I was in the hospital for the most part. Once I tested, the test came back and they were like, yes, you have leukemia. I pretty much spent the next 8 months in a hospital, and, my immune system was wrecked. I wasn't really going anywhere. They were very kind. Definitely a lot of prayers were said in my name. And, I can't discount whether that is the reason I'm still here. I just don't know.
Yeah.
Definitely, science played a good part in it, but I feel like there, a lot of faith had to come in there too, and a lot of positive energy being put out into the ether, so to speak, my direction for me to still be here. I only had a 30% chance of survival, and And here I am, and it's 27 years later. So,
yeah.
So lucky me. There's plenty of kids, that get cancer and other horrendous diseases that don't make it. And I feel very grateful every day because of that. No matter how bad things get, I'm very grateful for the fact that I'm here to just experience them at all.
I can imagine. And it's really, it's a good observation too, that, on the one hand, you had the medical technology in your corner. And on the other hand, there was the prayers, positive thinking, and prayers and positive thinking are important, but we also need problem solving.
Right.
And that's where the medicine comes in. So yeah, it's tough these days when there seems to be such a distrust of science and problem solving, and it seems to be driven by people perceiving science and medicine and whatnot as an attack on prayer, positive thinking, whatever, when that's just not the case.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. So, if we're talking about arguments for the existence of God, there's, the classic ontological arguments, there's the cosmological arguments, and the ones that have always been the most appealing to me are the teleological arguments. I just think that those make the most sense. The idea that there has to be some sort of intelligent designer behind the design. That just always rang more true for me than anything, at least in my experience. It just makes the most sense. It makes me think about Paley's watchmaker analogy. It's like if you come across a pocket watch and you look at it and you observe it, it's like, look at all these moving parts. It's very intricate. It has a specific purpose. So, and I think the comparison that they used in that analogy was to the human eye. And it's like, well, the human eye is also very, very technical. It's a very precise machine designed to do one thing. And if it appears to be designed to do this one thing, it has rods and it has cones and it has, the iris and the cornea, and they all have specific functions to make this one object work, much like, Paley's analogy of the pocket watch. So there has to be some sort of designer behind it. It just doesn't make sense to me that there can be, that's just evolution and happenstance. No, I'm not saying that evolution doesn't exist. I'm certainly not saying that at all. I definitely believe in evolution. I think Darwin's theory of evolution is pretty spot on. But there's just so many questions, there's just so many questions. It blows my mind. I could sit and have this conversation all day, and those are the days I try to have.
Yeah. Well, it's hard too. And I wonder sometimes if it's a matter of a person's makeup or temperament or whatever that predisposes them either to speculate metaphysically or to just dismiss the whole question. Mm-hmm. I think, I'm not a fantastic artist. I think I write well, but I don't think I'm Shakespeare. But I have to say I have a creative capacity. So I create things. I have created several of these novels, and so given that, it's hard for me to conceive of anything made, anything designed that doesn't have a designer behind it, because I'm a designer myself.
Right.
And know that when I'm trying to make something that works or that has some integrity, all the parts have to somehow cohere. And there has to be, there can be a little element of chaos, but chaos can't dominate. And so it's just hard for me to see the universe as something where chaos just dominates and there's nothing that designs or helps things to cohere. It's just hard to imagine.
It's really hard to imagine. I mean, just the fact that life exists in the first place, the conditions had to be so precise on I could name a dozen different factors that had to be exactly as they are for life to even exist, much less for us to have evolved and gotten to the point where we're at. And like I said, this is coming from someone who, when I was sick and when I was in the hospital, I absolutely, even with all the prayer and everything, I was 13. I was, a rebellious 13-year-old at the time. And, I already didn't like going to church. And now I've been diagnosed with this terminal illness. And for me, God just didn't exist at that time, and it's only later in life that I really started examining some of these questions and really putting thought into it. And I just, we get back on the conversation of evil again. Like, if there is a God, why would he do that to a child? Why would he do that to, hundreds of thousands and millions of children? Why would, like you said, why would genocide happen? And I think if we're talking about evil, it's really important to have a functional definition for the word evil, which is something that can be hard to pin down because you have moral evil and you have natural evil, and moral evil is entirely subjective. So that, like I said, these are things I don't want to say I struggle with them, but these are the questions that are constantly playing in my head that I'm constantly trying to come to a conclusion for. I have all these premises for, why God would exist. I have all the premises for why God wouldn't exist. And sometimes the conclusions can get a little muddy because some of the premises are a little off and they can be, refuted and disproven. And, thus is the problem with that question in general,
The problem of suffering.
Yeah, exactly. The problem of suffering. And that's a pretty big problem because suffering abounds. There is sickness and aging and death, and those are inescapable. And then, there's mental proliferations, the creation of our own suffering. There's, as we already said, there's genocide, there's homicide, rape. We could just go on and name off things that could be defined as evil, but without the definition of what evil is, then, how do we categorize it? How can we, without a functional definition of evil? And, I'm pretty sure that we could, if we sat down with 100 people, we could ask them, what is evil to them? And they would name a lot of the same things. But I think it's all in how we define it. I think it's all in the term and the term and the language that we use. For some people, murder wouldn't be a hard stretch for them. There's plenty of people out there who have killed, and whether it be because they were just quote unquote following orders, or whether it be because they had the desire in their heart to do so. How do we define evil? That's a tough question. What do you think about that?
Well, I can't begin to presume. I think part of the struggle of being human is, and being a human among humans, is trying to come to a consensus about how to respond, first of all, to moral evil and to natural evil. And when there's not agreement, especially on issues of what constitutes a moral evil, then it's a labyrinth. I have very strong views about, say, the death penalty. Some people are going to see that as a moral evil. Some people don't. And I suppose there are reasonable arguments on both sides.
Right.
But the problem is it is too subjective, like you were saying.
Yeah.
But it feels like it shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah.
Everyone should agree with me about what I think is wrong.
I think that's everybody's thoughts, right? I've got it right. I've got it right, and nobody else has it right. And so listen to me. This is my idea. I mean, that's just human nature. I think we just want to be right. But yeah, that's such a tough question. What is the functional definition of evil? And, how do we even define those terms? Because without, then we have to define what good is as well. We have to come up with a functional definition of good as well as evil, because as we already talked about, without good, evil cannot exist. Without evil, good cannot exist. So you have to have the light and the dark in order to be able to have either. They can't exist independently of each other. They have to exist simultaneously. It's kind of like I'll think of it in a second.
And that's why I like Adam's, analysis, and her she's being careful to really go as deep as she can into the question and ask, and posit these horrendous evils as, and defines them as something that just evacuates meaning, and in that way overwhelms the good of existing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's exactly the Hegelian dialectic, it's, you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because you can't have one without the other. I really want to check her books out. I mean, you said it was Marilyn McCord Adams.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm going to have to look into that. Those books, if they're along the lines of what you're saying, man, they sound pretty awesome. And I absolutely, I said, I love this subject. I love just as much, I'm a glutton for this kind of conversation and these topics. Like the more I can digest along these lines, the better for me personally. I can't think of a better way to spend my time than pondering the hard questions.
Well, and that's one good thing about the times we live in. It's hard to think of a book that you can't get a hold of these days.
Yeah.
So you should have no problem at all finding her work.
Yeah. So that is really fortunate. And we are very, very lucky to have the technology that we have and just have information available to us at our fingertips. I never imagined having a computer in my pocket, No. So, one thing this is going to be kind of a hard topic, probably, I think. I've talked with a lot of my guests lately about this. There's so much in the news now, especially with the COVID and everything that's going on. And there's we were just talking about science and having trust in the science and faith in the science. And I'm not on one side of the fence or the other as far as the vaccine debate is concerned, right? I'm pretty square in the middle. I think people should be able to do what they want to do. I don't think there should be a mandate. There are people out there who don't trust the science and they've got good reasons not to, I could go into a lot of those. I could definitely go into reasons why people should trust the science behind it. But then you get, there's so much division between people on this topic lately. And that's kind of what disturbs me, is the division that's being created over the vaccine and over people's personal medical decisions. And then, you have the people who are pro-vaccination basically saying that the people who are maybe not even against it, but just unsure, that they're terrible people, that not getting the vaccine in itself is an act of evil because of the possible implications that, they may be still spreading the disease. But then you've got, these cases of long-term COVID of vaccinated patients who are also able to spread the disease, right? So there's really, you can play one side of the fence or the other, but it's just I think the main point that I'm getting at is there's a lot of, how can I put this? There's a lot of people being there. There's people being made out to be evil by surely making their own decisions and trying to inform themselves before just making a hasty decision over something that could be potentially detrimental to their health. And so you have a whole group of people just being ostracized and subjected to name calling and what would essentially amount to abuse over a personal decision that, in my opinion, if you can still contract COVID after being vaccinated and you can still transmit COVID after being vaccinated, it seems to me that especially if you've already had COVID itself, you probably have antibodies. I'm not a scientist, but that seems to be the science behind it, is that once you've had it, you have antibodies against it. So if you can transmit the disease either way, then why is it anybody's business what you do with your own body, you know? And
well, I do think that, I wouldn't call people who resist the vaccination evil, but I do.
I wouldn't either. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, this is an engineered controversy.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
That
I'm glad we agree on that.
I think it's, there is no question to me that the vaccine is effective against, and I've seen it up close and personal with my nearest and dearest getting breakthrough infections. So I realize that the vaccine's not perfect, but it's the best tool that we have, along with the masks. And I think that, as a librarian, I teach research methods, and research is a lot more than going online.
Oh, absolutely.
And I just think people are too quick to feel like they're getting the answers from other people who have absolutely no training or expertise or knowledge of how viruses affect the human body.
Right.
So I trust the doctors on this one. Yeah. And I've had the vaccine, and I had a bad day afterwards. I felt pretty drug out, just like every time I get the flu vaccine. So I mean, this is, I was vaccinated as a baby. If every time people go overseas, they get vaccinated.
Right.
This is something that it has political implications.
Oh,
and so that's being exploited.
Definitely.
And killing people.
Yeah, 100%. I think, I mean, I'll probably be called a crazy conspiracy theorist, but I think the whole thing was, has a lot of political implications. I think it always has. I think perhaps it was by design. And like I said, I'm sure people will call me a crazy conspiracy theorist for that, but that's fine. They can call me whatever they want. I'm not concerned with what they think about me. But, it recently came out that the U.S. was, just like they had speculated towards the beginning of the pandemic, that they were doing gain of function research at this lab in Wuhan, and that this was an engineered virus. But, we were sold this whole wet market story. Oh, it came from this wet market in Wuhan, and, well, maybe, but, the U.S. was, Fauci signed off on gain of function research at the Wuhan lab. And then here we are with this disease. And it's like, I don't know, man, there's just too many questions. You know what I'm saying? Like and like I said, I like to analyze things critically. And, you look and you see that half of the news stations that are reporting, are sponsored by Pfizer. And if you're sponsored by Pfizer, you're pretty much controlled by Pfizer, so, and, like I said, and I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm not casting stones. I'm not, making aspersions. I'm not doing anything of the sort. All I'm saying is, just like, with does God exist? Does God not exist? There's a lot of questions, and we can go either way with this. and probably come up with a lot of good premises and a lot of good conclusions on both sides. My thing is just the division that's being caused, and to know that that's probably an engineered thing, that in itself is evil to me.
Well, I'm not saying that the virus, I don't think the virus.
No. I'm not saying I am saying that the virus was engineered. I'm absolutely saying that because there's proof that they were doing gain of function research on coronavirus in bats at the Wuhan lab that was being funded by the U.S. The NIH just came out with that a couple of weeks ago. So, I mean, that's just a fact at this point. It's not even like really debatable.
Well, what I was saying was that the divisions and the disagreements are being exploited.
And that's what I'm saying. And the division and the disagreements are manufactured as well. We're almost being forced at each other's throats. The media is creating the division. And then you have to look at it and say, well, why? Why would they do that? And then we open up a whole another line of questioning that I'm not even ready for it at this point,
We can agree we don't have all the information yet.
Oh, for sure.
For me, it's a little different than metaphysical speculation, just because, for the most part, metaphysical speculation, you're not dealing with hard evidence ever.
Right.
You're dealing with
with
ideas. It's the realm of ideas.
Right. Yeah. It's a relation of ideas. Yeah.
Real world problems, I think, are a little different, and
for sure,
the evidence will fall into place one way or the other. We've just got to be patient with each other.
Yeah, and that's
try to take care of each other, and it doesn't kill us to wear masks.
100%, it does not kill us to wear masks, and that just brings every religion preaches one thing. If you really get right down to the core of essentially every religion, and that's the love, being kind to each other. And yeah, I'm just not seeing that a lot lately. It just makes me really sad. It makes me really sad, man.
Within families.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I said, the divisiveness of, I mean, and I can only speak for the United States because that's where I'm at. But I assume that it's probably much like that in other places because, why wouldn't it be? Just the division that's being caused over vaccine, not vaccine, in the middle. Like if you're in the middle, then you might as well be unvaccinated at this point because you're going to be lumped into the same, even if you've had the vaccine, but you still have questions, I don't know, man. There's just too many questions. Too many questions in the world, not enough answers.
Well, as far as the pandemic goes, I just want it to be over with.
I think we can all agree on that. I think we can all agree. Well, most of us. I'm sure maybe there's somebody out there who doesn't want it to be over for some reason or another, but I'm certainly not that person. I'm definitely ready for it to just be over. I'm sick of, seeing people get sick. I'm sick of seeing people die. I'm sick of hearing about it. We're being honest. We're really being honest. I'm just sick of hearing about it. It's like, man, we change the subject to anything else.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And I'm sure it will change eventually. Either it's going to go away or it'll become such a part of culture that, it'll be treated just like the flu is. And we won't hear about it except for occasionally. And something else will be in the news, and we'll talk about that, and that'll create division.
There's always drama.
Yeah, there's got to be, right? That's what makes the news interesting.
Yep.
Otherwise, people wouldn't tune in. I'm not a big fan of. I'm not really a big fan of the news because basically they're just, most of the time they're just selling fear. That's all they're doing. I mean, how often do you hear about the, 250,000 planes that landed safely today? You always hear about the one that crashes. You don't get the good news. You always get the bad news because people, that's people have that negativity bias. That just seems to be what they're into. And I can't explain that either.
Well, and I'm no expert in media analysis, but I am old enough to remember a time when there were just 3 TV stations along with public television.
Right.
And it definitely, the culture was divided then, but nowhere near what it is now. So I think part of the issue is the proliferation of choices and the fact that that's been, pretty lucrative.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably been very lucrative. And I think that's why we have so many choices and why we have so many different varying opinions on literally any subject we could talk about. We could talk about how to make cheesecake properly, and we're going to have 50 people saying 50 different things, more than likely. This is it's in human nature.
Yeah, there's no going back, so we're just going to have to figure it out somehow.
Yeah, we're riding it out, man. We're riding it out. Well, we could get into an interesting conversation with that too. Is it'd be right back to the conversation we were already having about natural evil. Like, oh well, if a God does exist, then why would we be going through this horrible pandemic right now? But you can't, like I said, you can't have light without dark, and that's the rub.
Well, and one thing I've always, in the few situations where I've been teaching, writing, I've always told students, when you're blocked in terms of ideas and you don't know where to go, or you don't know where to start, basically. What it comes down to is stories are, if they're going to work at all, they're always based around some kind of conflict. So if you've got a problem, you've got a story, you've got something to work with.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe that has something to do with the kind of the yin and yang of our situation.
Hey, very well
to have that tension to be creative.
Right. Well, then we can go right back to the Tao with that. Like I said, it's you have to have a problem to have a solution. There's actually let me pull that up real quick. Yeah. It's the second passage in the Tao Te Ching. It says, when people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other.
It's beautiful. Some of the best poetry comes out of these. Oh yeah,
if not even extremely poignant and extremely true, because those things, are just inherently true. Being and non-being do create each other, because you can't have one without the other. You can't. But not only is it poignant and is it truthful? It's just beautiful poetry, really.
And universal too. It reminds me of Ecclesiastes right there in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Everything, there's a season. So these ideas are, they're original in one sense, but universal in another.
Absolutely. So what are your books about, man? They're obviously definitely have a theological tilt to them, but, are they just, is there any one thing that ties them together, or are they just different stories, or?
Well, it's hard to say. So the first one that I was able to get a publisher for came out, I think, in 2016, and it's called Familiar. And so it's kind of absurd. I meant for it to be absurd. So it's a chicken who is, hatched on a farm, mm-hmm. and there's a young woman who's visiting the farm. It's kind of like Charlotte's Web, and she's a vegan. And so she's upset with her family her family owns the farm for, raising livestock, but she takes in this chicken, and because the chicken's a runt, the mother won't take care of it, and it's kind of left to die. So she takes in this chicken, And by sitting on her lap, the chicken learns to read. And from there, learns how to communicate, scratches letters in her palm like Helen Keller. And from there, just develops his intelligence. He starts to read the encyclopedia. And he then, comes across articles in the encyclopedia on religion, and eventually starts to get books out of the library that, his existence is secret. So they get books for him out of the library. And he reads a certain book by Wittgenstein, and he decides to become a Catholic. So he wants to be baptized as a Catholic, goes to the local Catholic church. They refute, they can't baptize a chicken. So he takes it all the way to the Vatican. And that's the story. I won't give away the ending.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. That's wild, man. That's really good. That's really good. That's super creative too. I love it.
And so from that, I did a couple of books. I'm really obsessed with, I have a lot of friends from an area of North Carolina that's very isolated near the Outer Banks. So these isolated islands. And so I did a couple of novels based in that area, not necessarily having any theological themes, just kind of, coming of age, family stuff. And then my last book is that came out this year, or the end of last year. When did that come? Oh, no, it came out June of this year. It's called The Rat Reverend Clancy and the Seven Sacraments. And it's a rat who lives in a church. He listens to the sermons. He becomes born again, and he wants to start his own church with the animals out in the churchyard. And so the novel is basically the story of this rat named Clancy who he wants to spread the word. And so that's what he does.
It's like Ratatouille, but with God instead of food.
Yeah. I've never seen that, so I'm not copying it, but I know the general story, and you're exactly right.
I love it, man. That's awesome. So, are your books pretty much available everywhere? Or?
Yeah. I always tell people, of course, Amazon. Familiar's been out so long that you can actually get it pretty cheap on Amazon. If you don't want to support that, I always tell people, if you've got a local independent bookstore, they can get everything. They just order through a distributor called Ingram. Okay. And so that helps them. That helps me. So you can order that way. My website, I've got links to purchase on all my books that are in print right now, so you can go through that. Just how whatever works for anyone who wants to read them.
Right on. And what's your website?
It's got a funny name because let me get that. Well, not name, but a funny URL, because I didn't pay to have like my own custom sort of URL. Let me get that here. Where is it? Oh, there it is. So that is David L. Carter, my name, all one word, DAVIDLCARTER.wixsite, WIXSITE.com.
That's not too complicated.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Right on, man. Well, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and have this conversation, man. It's been really fun. Like I said, I really enjoy having these like theological, does God exist? Does God not exist? What is the nature of evil? Like I said, that's like right in my wheelhouse, man. So I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Well, I can't give you any answers about that, but I can definitely point you in the direction of some good theologians. So, Marilyn McCord Adams. So hopefully you'll enjoy that.
Absolutely. I hope that other people will look into that as well if they have these types of questions.
Yeah, definitely.
So, big thanks again to David Carter for taking the time to talk to me. If you'd like to get in touch with him or check out any of his work, there will be links in the liner notes of the episode on dharmajunkiepodcast.com. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, preferably on Apple Podcasts or really wherever podcasts are found. I really appreciate you listening. This has been Dharma Junkie. Namaste.
Chaos is beautiful.